Hello everyone, welcome back to AS Biology with Dr. Demi. I am Dr. Demi, and in today's video I will be taking you through chapter 10 of the AS Biology syllabus. Now this video is a continuation of the first part of chapter 10, so if you haven't watched that video I suggest that you start there. In that video I also start infectious diseases. I tell you about the causative agents of the different diseases you have to focus on, and I also share with you some information on malaria and cholera. In this video, we're going to look at HIV, tuberculosis, and measles. So again, we are zooming into Africa, and if you live elsewhere, please by all means share any information on the region where you are in the comments so that other students can interact with that. Most of my students happen to be from Africa. I live in Africa at the moment, so I prefer to share lots of statistics from Africa so that students can learn about their continent a bit more. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you will see that HIV is quite prevalent. In South Africa, for example, 5.2 million people as at the time this data was taken. And this was quite a few years ago, so it is definitely very prevalent. But something to applaud South Africa for is the fact that there have been lots of efforts in addressing HIV. There have been a lot of scientific research to help discover preventive medicines for HIV or even medicines that suppress the virus. So there have been a lot of advancements in that area, and obviously the country is making strides towards ensuring that everybody is healthy and HIV free, so it's a good thing. But in other countries in Africa, I'm not really sure, so if you live there, please make sure that you share any information that you have with us in the comments section. So what is HIV? HIV is called a human immunodeficiency virus, and just like its name suggests, it is a virus that makes the immune system of an infected person deficient. What this means is that the immune system is suppressed and unable to fight any infections that invade the body. This of course is very dangerous, and that is why HIV is such a dangerous virus. HIV is also called a retrovirus, and I'm going to explain to you what this means. Now, if you remember from the first chapter when we were discussing the structure of viruses, we said viruses in very simple terms are made up of a protein coat and a RNA or DNA, so a genetic material. In terms of HIV, and obviously as you can see here, it becomes a little bit more complicated when you look at an actual virus. And I bet if you lived through the coronavirus pandemic, this doesn't look as strange anymore. You've probably seen a lot of images like this. But this is what HIV typically looks like. It has an RNA, it doesn't have DNA, so it has RNA. It also has this enzyme over here called reverse transcriptase, and it has another enzyme here called protease. It has different receptors on its surface, but you don't have to worry too much about that as we go on. Why is HIV called a retrovirus? That's because reverse transcriptase is able to transcribe or reverse transcribe the RNA of HIV to DNA. So if you remember when we discussed protein synthesis in chapter 6, we said we go from DNA to RNA and then we go to a protein. In terms of HIV, because it doesn't have DNA, it carries RNA. Reverse transcriptase will take that RNA and reverse transcribe it down to DNA or back to DNA, right? That DNA will then incorporate itself into the DNA of the infected person, and we will speak a bit now about the cells that are typically infected. It incorporates itself into the DNA of the infected person, and so it becomes part of the DNA, which means that when that DNA is copied, then many more of the viral DNA would also be copied. They would also be carried to the ribosomes. They would also be made into viral proteins, and as you make more viral proteins, it means that the virus starts to invade different cells within the body until the immune system is fully suppressed. It infects the helper T cells in particular. Now, when we discuss immunity, you will learn a lot more about the helper T cells. But what I will say here in this video is that the helper T cells help to activate an immune response. So if the helper T cells are affected by HIV, it means that if a pathogen of any kind were to invade the body, the helper T cells will not sound the alarm quickly enough for that invasion to be destroyed, which then means that the person is open or vulnerable to all kinds of opportunistic pathogens. And that is why people don't die from HIV infections per se. They actually die from other diseases that infect their bodies. And that is why I put a question here that did you know that AIDS itself, which is something that is developed as a result of HIV, is not a disease. AIDS stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. So it's not a disease actually, it's just a situation whereby the helper T cells have been really suppressed, or some of them have been destroyed, and as a result of that the immune system is suppressed because the helper T cells are not able to send signals when an invasion happens. And as a result of that, people can die from other conditions, such as having TB, like that's tuberculosis. People have different cancers that develop because the immune system is not responsive, and some people suffer from fever, sweating, and some of the symptoms of HIV include having flu-like symptoms and then just not having any symptoms at all afterwards. So it is quite a dangerous disease because people can live with it for a very long time and not be aware that they have it. So how is HIV transmitted? You can get HIV if you have sexual intercourse without protection. It can be passed from a mother to her baby. If you share injecting equipment with a person, you can easily catch HIV, get HIV rather, or if you receive contaminated blood during blood transfusions. That is why obviously when you go and donate blood, you would be asked if you have any conditions and you would also be tested. So these infographic from avert.org is really, really good because it helps you see at first glance all the ways that you can have HIV. Also, having multiple sexual partners can increase your chances of contracting HIV. Now, you can't get HIV from kissing a person, from hugging people, from sharing food, from an insect bite. You can't get it from toilet seats, even from bathing, from sneezing and coughing, or from sweat. And this is important because when HIV first came to light, people were very judgmental and people were very scared of it because they just thought, well, I don't want to get something that would suppress my immune system. And they assumed that even hugging an HIV positive person would result in them contracting HIV. So again, this infographic from avert.org is really great. And also, just to put a disclaimer, I wasn't paid to promote this, but I found it online and I just thought it was really good in the way that it outlined the many ways that you cannot get HIV. Now, HIV, like we said, is just a virus invading the body and suppressing the immune system. And obviously, it leads to AIDS. And AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which basically means at this point, when AIDS has been achieved, that the immune system is almost fully suppressed and it's not able to function. And as a result of that, you can find that most people would have opportunistic infections. Some people have oral thrush, which is caused by Candida albicans, and there's also a rare form of pneumonia that can also result from that. A very common sign of a person having HIV is Kaposi's sarcoma. It is a skin cancer that is associated with HIV, and as you can see here, it's like a herpes-like virus that spreads around the body or on the skin. You can also have cancer of the internal organs because the immune system is unable to find cancer cells and to kill them off. And so as a result of that, the body is just open to any kind of infection and people can literally die from anything. Okay, HIV done. Now we discuss tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, as you can see, from 1990 up until 2005, the landscape of it has really changed. So back in 1990, tuberculosis in Africa was not that intense, but interestingly, it happened to progress between 1990 to 2005. And you can see here that quite a significant portion of populations have been affected by tuberculosis. Of course, in some parts of Africa, the incidences remain very low, which is very good, but in other parts it's also it's very common. And you would find that in most of the places where tuberculosis is common, you will see that the HIV incidence rates are also high. So the percentages are actually telling you about the HIV incidence rate. So for example, I believe this is Botswana. That's a 70% HIV incidence rate over there, and it means that more than 400 per 100,000 of the population would have tuberculosis. What causes it? Tuberculosis is actually caused by a bacteria. It is a rod-shaped bacteria, but you can see that it is a rod-shaped bacterium rather, but you can see that it looks a little bit different from the bacterium that causes cholera in the sense that it doesn't have a flagellum. But again, these are not questions that you would be asked, but it is important, again, like I said at the beginning of the previous video, that you know what the causative agent of each of these diseases. So tuberculosis is caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis and by Mycobacterium bovis. They both live on human cells, and especially in the lungs. They're able to spread, and they basically cause tuberculosis by creating all kinds of infections within the respiratory system. So some of the symptoms of tuberculosis is a racking cough. People cough a lot when they have tuberculosis. Some people cough out blood. Some people have chest pain. There's shortness of breath. There's fever, sweating, and many people lose a lot of weight. And this is the thing with tuberculosis, because sometimes when people get it, they assume that they have the general flu, or it's a really bad flu, it's going to go away. But that turns out not to be the case. The pathogen has an incubation period of a few weeks to several years. So some people can be infected with tuberculosis but not show any signs of it. And some people have tuberculosis and they show signs. And sometimes, if the immune system has been compromised, people are likely to die from it. Tuberculosis is more likely to be transmitted in places where there's a lot of overcrowding. And obviously, if you think about that, you would then think of places like informal settlements, where there are lots of people that are clustered together in very small spaces. And if one person gets infected, then it is easy to transmit it to another person. If you think of it in the sense of the COVID-19 pandemic, simply think of the fact that tuberculosis is spread by the droplets that come from a person sneezing and coughing. So you can see here with this infographic that the Japan Anti-Tuberculosis Association prepared in 2007, that this is a person who's got tuberculosis, and you can see that as they sneeze, the bacteria is carried in the droplets, and it would infect someone else if the person is not healthy. But obviously, most of the time, even if the person inhales some of those droplets, the nasal passage or the throat would be able to destroy the tuberculosis. But in many cases, people are not as healthy as they should be, and that means that tuberculosis is able to move down into their lungs and cause an infection. Mycobacterium bovis, which is the other bacterium that causes tuberculosis, actually infected cows a lot. So when you think of bovis, you actually think of cows. And there was a time between 1850 and 1950 in the UK where about 800,000 cows were infected, and there were about 30 deaths, which some people might say, well, that's not a lot, but one death is already one too many if you're a person who is passionate about public health, about infectious diseases, and even a biologist, a microbiologist that's just trying to assure the health of the population. Streptomycin is the antibiotic that is often used to treat TB, and you've probably heard of the issue streptomyces, which itself is a bacteria that is related to like sore throats. So you can say you have a strep throat, but streptomycin is the antibiotic that is able to treat that. But as we will find as we go on, some antibiotics are no longer effective simply because many of these organisms have developed antibiotic resistance. So what causes antibiotic resistant tuberculosis? Those are questions that we'll answer, but this is just a flashing question to put in your mind. We'll move on from here, but you will see that in the next video, I address antibiotic resistance in detail. Just something to get you going is to think of the fact that antibiotics are now used very frequently in farming, even in raising cows, and as a result of that, the organisms that cause tuberculosis are now able to adapt to that antibiotic. So that means that when you use the antibiotic, the organisms are no longer susceptible to it, and as a result of that, the antibiotic just doesn't work. But we'll discuss that in detail in the next video. The last disease that you have to know according to this syllabus, I'm not sure if the syllabus would have changed by the time you watch this video, but this is the syllabus that ends in 2020. So if there are any significant changes, hopefully you'd be able to make up for those. But that's measles in Africa. And measles is caused by a virus that multiplies in the nasal cavity and also in the trachea. People who get measles usually don't have symptoms for about 2 weeks, but afterwards they would develop a rash and a fever, and they have other symptoms such as fever, cold, conjunctivitis, and also they have small white spots. So if you look here at this image, this is what a measles outbreak would typically look like. It's a rash that appears on the skin, and sometimes measles are transmitted through droplets that come from coughing or sneezing, that is done by infected persons. So back in the day, children in developed countries were always said to be susceptible to measles, but because of the use of vaccines, they are now pretty healthy and people are less likely to develop measles. So vaccinations have played a big role in eradicating some of the diseases that we have learned about, or some of the diseases that used to exist. We will learn about vaccinations when we go into chapter 11, but I hope this is a good introduction for you. So I'm going to end it here now, and I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments and I will try as much as possible to get back to you. If you have anything you want to clarify or any information you would want to share in the comments, that would be really awesome. I hope for this to be as interactive as possible, even if it's an asynchronous class. That's it from me for today. Have a good time. Goodbye.